Welcome to the Terminology's leading practice stream of SNOMED CT Expo 2023. My name is Liara Tatina, and I'm the Customer Relations Executive for Asia and Pacific region and Global Education Lead at SNOMED International. I'll be moderating today's session. All questions will be answered at the conclusion of the presentation. Online attendees, please use the Q&A button to type your questions to the presenter. On-site attendees, please use the microphone provided in the room. I'm now pleased to introduce Sara Carvalho from University of Aveiro. Welcome, Sara. And Dr. Cornelia Wermuth from KU Leuven Campus Antwerpen, who will be presenting Exploring the Role of Terminology in SNOMED CT Definitions, Challenges and Solutions. Sara and Cornelia, please go ahead.
Thank you. So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As it was mentioned, I'm from Portugal, University of Aveiro, and also the Linguistics Research Center at Nova Lisbon, together with my colleague Ruth Costa, who cannot be here today, unfortunately, and our colleague Cornelia Wermuth from Leuven, the Leuven University. So we are here to talk about the role of terminology in SNOMED CT definitions and basically share our reflections and the work we have been doing about that. So our motivation is clear. So the three of us are linguists and terminologists. Cornelia Wermuth for a long time has been collaborating with the SNOMED CT translation user group. Well, myself much more recently, but it's now become official. And very, very soon, we became aware of the importance of textual definitions for the translation work. As we will see in more detail in a few minutes, the main issue is that very often the definitions do not exist in SNOMED CT. And in some of the existing ones, there are some consistency issues that we will also address. And so the main question for this talk is how terminology can support textual definition drafting in SNOMED CT. And the main focus is really to assist the translation process of this resource. So let's start with a bit of theoretical background from our side. So as I mentioned, we are, the three of us are terminologists, and within terminology, of course, we have several approaches that are possible. We just wanted to emphasize the fact that, of course, you may see terminology only from a linguistic standpoint with the terms, but there's a conceptual side that is essential to the whole thing and must not be understated. And so, well, working with SNOMED CT as a concept-based resource, it makes a lot of sense to have this approach. Also from the methodological side, the fact that there is often in more traditional terminology, let's say, the distinction between an onomasiological and a semasiological approach in terminology work, the former having the concept as a starting point and the latter the term as a starting point. Well, we argue that these two are not always, so the boundaries are not always straightforward, that they are interdependent and very often influence each other. And here I just included a screenshot of some of the work I've developed for my PhD, where I created a terminological resource about endometriosis that had the concept as a starting point. But in fact, this was very helpful in the analysis of the texts, the corpora. And then the texts provided useful information and pointed towards linguistic descriptions of concepts that did not exist in the initial concept systems and that the experts that I've worked with thought were essential. So basically the linguistic helped feed into the conceptual side again. Then a formal ontology was created, and at that point, that's when I started reflecting about the role of formal definitions and how that could build into natural language definitions as a foundation, a solid foundation to provide consistency. So regarding definitions, just a brief overview. So how are they perceived in terminology work? Well, there is a big, still in certain areas of terminology, there's still a big Aristotelian tradition of something being defined through the genus proximum and differentia specifica. The two main terminology ISO standards, so 1087 and 704, rely on this Aristotelian tradition. And so the definition is one of the possibilities of representing a concept. And as you can see here, it is important to emphasize that the definition should differentiate the concept from other related concepts. And so what the ISO standards propose is what is called intentional definition, which involves conveying the immediate generic concept plus the delimiting characteristics. So the characteristics that differentiate the concept from other related concepts. Over the years, and following up on this more traditional approach, let's say, there have been several guidelines issued by many authors, some of whom you can see here, on how to draft these intentional definitions. But it is clear that, well, even today, this can be a very time-consuming manual process that is prone to many inconsistencies. So this, and again, the expertise that this requires is enormous. So this is important because, again, in recent years, there have been some approaches that have been advocating going a little bit beyond the hierarchical relations between concepts and trying to integrate the non-hierarchical concept relations as well in the drafting of textual definitions. So in that note, we would like to highlight this concept of definitional templates that, again, is not new. And it was introduced in the late 1990s. But the frame-based terminology approach by Pamela Faber and her group in Granada have picked up on these definitional templates and have introduced them into the drafting of textual definitions as mini knowledge representations. There were several studies conducted in different domains, but we would like to take this further in the sense that we think that a more formal conceptual approach through ontologies is an added value. Okay, so as you all know, in SNOMED CT, concepts can be represented in 3 different ways: the FSN, the formal definition, and the textual definition. Well, as we've mentioned before, it doesn't mean that they do not exist, but at the moment they are underrepresented, let's say. And this has some issues for the translators, and that's our main driver here. So again, as you also know, there are currently 16 languages or language varieties in SNOMED CT. You also know how the translation process works. So mainly the translations are coordinated by the NRCs of the member countries, and they define the content that is to be translated. Of course, people work in interdisciplinary teams, and usually the translators start with the FSN, but they may resort to the concept modeling, the textual definition, if it is available. Also use or analyze the use of a target term in context, and of course, consult the domain experts. What is the status update? So basically, of course, it is obvious that everything is important: formal, textual definitions, contextual use of the term. But of course, we come back to this survey from 2011, where 63% of SNOMED CT direct users claim that textual definitions would be useful. To our knowledge, well, we don't know if something similar is being prepared more recently, so another type of survey where this would be tackled as well. But the current situation is that, as we've mentioned, textual definitions are still underrepresented. So in this paper from 2019 that analyzed the US version of SNOMED CT, gave some numbers. So about 1.3% of all SNOMED CT concepts have textual definitions, and a little bit over 3% of disease concepts. So that's clearly an underrepresentation. And the main issue that we raise here is that for translators that might not have the medical expertise, and that may have some more difficulties understanding SNOMED CT concepts from the FSN or going through the formal definition only, this would be very helpful, the textual definitions. Plus, as we will see, it may happen that the formal concept representations may contain also some inconsistencies. And so if the translator does not have the sufficient domain knowledge, it may be difficult to detect these inconsistencies. So overall, I think it's clear that the case that we are making for textual definitions to support the SNOMED CT translation tasks. So let's take a look at a concrete example. So this is a concept currently in SNOMED CT of single port laparoscopic cholecystectomy. So as we can see here, it is a primitive concept. The definition of the concept is the same as the parent concept, so a laparoscopic cholecystectomy. And so the single port element of the FSN is nowhere to be seen in the formal definition. And so even if we want to create or automate the natural language or the textual definition process through the formal definition, we would get the same result for both concepts. So at the moment, there's no way to differentiate one from the other. And again, several attempts have already been made. Well, one of them is here to basically go from the formal definition to the textual, well, perhaps description automatically. And this is one of the tools that is still available, SNO to ENG. And this is what we get. Okay, so again, for translation purposes, probably it would not get us very far if the translator has doubts about the meaning of this concept. Again, it's not very visible here, but you will have access to the slides. But it says basically that, well, even myself have, but the single port laparoscopic cholecystectomy is a kind of laparoscopic cholecystectomy because it reproduces the formal definition that already exists. So how can we go about this? Well, terminology we think can help, as going back to our original premise, on the conceptual side and on the linguistic side. So on the conceptual side, we feel it could be relevant, again, to start discussing this together with colleagues from the translation user group, if there is interest, and also with people involved in the modeling, on how to integrate this sort of information, if they find it relevant. So our rationale was that a surgical procedure would have a surgical approach, and the range of surgical approach in SNOMED CT is a procedural approach. Well, single port is also mainly connected to the number of incisions, but this information on the number of incisions is not present in the procedural approach hierarchy. So a suggestion could be to add this to the hierarchy of the procedural approach and hence improve the formal definition. To do that, well, an example that we came back to was the work I've developed, where, again, for the creation of this terminological resource on endometriosis, I also felt the need to dig deeper into the surgical approach. And so here I'm just showing a map that shows the surgical approach hierarchy of the resource, where we have, well, 3 main types of differences from where you derive the differentiation between the different concepts as to the degree of invasiveness, the existence or not of skin incision of the procedure, surgical procedure in this case, and the number of skin incisions. So something like this could be discussed also if useful, because that would allow, again, to integrate this information into the formal definition. Here is an example of a concept that is similar in the sense that to the one that I've shown now, that is actually not in SNOMED at the moment, this concept. So laparoscopic single-site total hysterectomy that I've integrated into the resource of endometriosis due to the relevance of it, considered by the experts also. And so obviously this concept would inherit characteristics from total hysterectomy and laparoscopic single-site hysterectomy. And just to give you a brief framework, so here I've also, in this resource, I've reused relationships from SNOMED CT and UMLS. I've created a categorical structure before transforming or creating the formal ontology. And then in the has approach section, I've reused that hierarchy that I've shown earlier. So if that is possible, well, we suggest that terminology can be helpful again, in collaboration with the multidisciplinary team to try to pinpoint some of these inconsistencies and contribute to the improvement of the formal definition. If that is indeed the case, we know that it may be a drop in the ocean, but it may be relevant for those working on the translation. If that is possible, as I was saying, maybe we can introduce this notion of definitional templates into the process. And for instance, if we go back and see a proposal of a definitional template that would include the method, procedure, site direct, using access device and surgical approach, and the respective ranges. Again, with this procedural approach hint that I've provided earlier, that would mean that we could reuse practically almost all of the information from one concept to the other, the two that I've shown today, where only in fact, the body structure would change. So, of course, as I've mentioned, ideally, in an ideal world, the three ways of representing a concept in SNOMED CT should align. However, we have seen that this is not always the case. And here are some of the things that I've mentioned. The fact that some formal concept definitions lack one or more delimiting characteristics, and so the differentiation is difficult. And because it is difficult, it's difficult to automate from formal to textual. Sometimes there may also be ambiguity in the FSN. So I did not explain this, but for time reasons, for time constraints, we just included this one example, but we've listed, well, several others. Well, the formal definition may be incomplete. Just yesterday, we talked about things like service or the Welsh cake again. And so we've talked about this underrepresentation of textual definitions. There is one example that I added here to this slide. For instance, in cobblestone lysencephaly without muscular ocular involvement, there is a textual definition, but again, it doesn't match the formal one. So for the automation process, this raises a lot of difficulties. Also, we wanted to refer to something that, especially those that have been working with SNOMED for a long time, it is sometimes not clear where the textual definitions come from, and well, the policy for drafting them in the different languages might be useful to be defined. And so if indeed this is found pertinent by, well, firstly by the translation user group, and then going a bit beyond that, of course, some of the questions here would have to be addressed. So what would be the scope of such definitions? Some national releases have patient-friendly versions, so what would happen to those? Would those be more disseminated or not? Who or what would draft such definitions? So in case of an automated process, how would that unfold? The revision, so the workflow in general. We've added a reference here to guidelines published by the OBO Foundry that we found relevant also as a reflection point about this. And again, we also cannot deny that there's a growing trend in biomedical resources to include textual definitions. And these definitions are increasingly being consulted not only by, well, translators, but also by other user groups, namely patients, increasingly. And so what we wanted to show and share with you about these reflections is that the added value that we feel that terminology with both this conceptual and linguistic side can bring, well, on the one hand, to help contribute to this consistency of formal definitions. And then, of course, there will be a direct impact on also the quality and completeness of textual definitions. Also optimizing this process via these definitional templates. And of course, overall terminology as its main aim is the support of the effective communication among various stakeholders. And again, I'm highlighting patients. So also the issue of interoperability, both at the conceptual and the linguistic level. This is not here as part of the ongoing and future work, but I'm involved in the OntoLex community. So I don't know if you are aware of this. So the OntoLex community has produced a W3C standard called OntoLex on how to represent linguistic information as linked data. And they're very much interested now at the moment in developing a terminology module for OntoLex. And so I think the biomedical field would be a very interesting use case. So they are looking for that at the moment. So let's see how that will unfold. But there's a big issue here. So there's the O in linguistic linked open data. So the proprietary formats obviously are tricky here. Now, as ongoing and future work, as we've mentioned, we aim to collaborate with the SNOMED CT translation user group as much as possible in this endeavor. And of course, the question has to do with the automation process of the definition drafting. Well, even though we've focused our presentation on the needs of translators, as we've mentioned, we feel that this sooner rather than later will need to go beyond that because other user groups are going to be increasingly consulting SNOMED CT with the prevalence that it's acquiring at the moment, and rightly so. So that would be all from our side. Thank you. And we are now open for questions. Thanks.
Thank you. Sarah will now take questions. As a reminder, if you are in the room, please use the microphone to ask your questions.
I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with something simple but complicated. You very briefly mentioned the use case for definitions, and I think the main one we heard was translations. But what are the use cases for definitions in national content? Would I have to translate the definitions, or would I have to create my own definitions? Like, have you explored that area? Like, what happens next?
Well, I don't know, Cornelia, if you'd like to join me also for this, but again, it also depends on each national release center. So, for example, in Portugal at the moment, there's still no translation, so they're just starting. So actually, we were talking right before the break. So again, it also depends on the user groups that are going to use the resource. The way I see it, well, probably translating definitions might be helpful. But again, one of the things we didn't address here is the issue of so in the existing definitions, what sources are typically used for the definitions? Are there any copyright issues? So that, of course, would also need to be explored before making a decision on that, or whether translating or creating one's own definitions. Cornelia, would you like to add anything else? Yes. Yes, you have to.
This was a good question. It's my first remark. From a terminological viewpoint, definitions should not be translated, but should be drafted in each language in an original form. But I think it's very time consuming.
Yes.
If the English definitions are qualitative good, I see no reason why they could not be translated. But yes,
ideally, yes, they should be drafted in one's own language.
Yes, this
but this would be the ideal situation.
Yes.
But with everything else that is on the table for for translation of the resources.
But everything starts with the quality of the English definition, of course, yes. And the question of the sources, I don't know if there is an answer to this.
There's several things you covered there or highlighted that we deal with as authors all the time. I'm Monica, I manage the content team. So our problem with definitions is, one, we're dealing with legacy content, so we don't always know what the definition should be. We think we know, but we don't know. And where would the source be? Where is the right place to go to get that definition? So increasingly, we ask people when they submit new content to give us definitions, but we don't routinely add definitions unless, and we're still working on many of the fully specified names, as you said, are not clear. We're aware of that. That's part of what our QI project about is, to make things more consistent. So we're trying to fix that all the time. It's ongoing. But actually, if we got the FSNs right, and then we could automate definitions and accept those definitions as correct, that would be nice, because for us, it would be lots of work to do that manually.
Yes.
But when there are definitions, we try and make sure they're correct. And or if we're adding a new one, we do look for an authoritative source. We don't just make one up.
We also,
But the other thing I'd say to you, and maybe this is something that you all are aware of when you're translating, is the example you gave, the single port
Mhm.
laparoscopy. Would that really be in scope? Because it's just a laparoscopy. In the end, does a clinician really need to know how many incisions? And by the way, there'd be more than one because you need one for the gas going in as well. So
Yes.
there's a few things in there that it's not as straightforward as it
Mhm.
looks. So that's why we couldn't really say, looking at that, what the real definition was in terms of incisions and instruments and, but yeah, no, it's a good, interesting. But the translation user group be the place to start. And the other point I should make is that everything we do is member driven. So if members suddenly turn around and say, that's it, we want definitions, then that would be an enormous endeavor, but we'd have to do it.
yes,
But right now, we don't really have the mandate, but thank you.
thank you for your feedback. And just to mention that, as I've mentioned, sorry, Ula, just to make it clear, I mean, we are here to raise the issue, but also to be of service, let's say, right, to collaborate in any way, because we all want the same thing, that is a quality resource. So thanks again for your feedback.
My name is Ole Wolke from the Norwegian NRC and chairing the translation user group. So this is something which I've discussed in the translation user group for a translator. But what I see it from a Norwegian perspective, it's also beneficial for the clinicians, because in Norway, we only translate the term, the description. We don't translate the FSN,
Mhm.
and the clinicians, they don't normally check how it's modeled and all this. So their knowledge of the concept will through the term, and if they don't know the term, a definition would be nice. And that's what they say, that in ICD 11 they can get his textual definitions. SNOMED CT, we can only get the term. So I think it's also beneficial for the clinicians who have to read material which are not from their own speciality, for example. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks
Thank you,
also for
everyone.
your feedback.
Thank you. Great discussion. Thank you for your
No, thank you
presentation.
for the feedback.
With this, we will conclude the session. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Cornelia. And online delegates can join another session through the event lobby. Thank you.